Welcome back to Mainstream PC everyone, my name is Julian and today I will be talking to you about the AMD Radeon RX 5700 and we will be looking at a few things including flashing the vBIOS on these cards. In particular, I'm looking at the Gigabyte model here, the Gaming OC, which has been recommended not to be flashed with the 5700 XT vBIOS because it only has an 8-pin power connector. We'll have a look at that later. And in my opinion, most graphics cards these days are pretty overpriced. I managed to get this one at quite a steal of a deal from a guy called Pat. Shout out to you, Pat. He bought this card in Taiwan last year, brought it back home. He bought two of them actually, but since Crossfire is dead in 2020 or even in 2019, he had no use for this card and sold it to me at a really nice price. I wouldn't have bought it new, and if I had bought it new in warranty, I might be more reluctant to flash the vBIOS on it, at least if it's a card that doesn't have a dual BIOS like this one. However, since it was such a good deal, I decided to go ahead anyway and give it a try. And we will be looking at that in this video. I'll see you again in the outro. Let's have a look what this thing can do. So first of all, I had to establish a baseline of what the 5700 at stock was going to perform like. In order to do so, I decided to run TimeSpy the graphics test only. TimeSpy is a DirectX 12 benchmark running at 1440p. So pretty much a performance level where this card should land. It's supposed to be a 1440p card for modern titles. As we can see, we managed to score 8075 points, just stock out of the box. And for my next test, I was going to do some minor overclocking. To do so, I increased the maximum voltage frequency curve all the way to the right, so it can actually boost to 1850 megahertz, potentially, which is the limit for the 5700 BIOS, and I increased the power limit to 20% above the default, and then I ran another TimeSpy graphics test. And right off the bat I could tell that there was a small performance increase because I saw a few higher frames in specific spots. As we see the benchmark concluding here in the background, you can see that we managed to score 8441 points with just the stock 5700 BIOS with a maxed out voltage frequency curve and maxed out power limits. So the next step was to actually flash the card to become a 5700 XT. So to do so, I was going to tech PowerUp, since they have a great database of vBIOS, and found a vBIOS for the Gigabyte Gaming OC version of the 5700 XT, which is essentially just the 5700 XT version of my 5700. Here you can see me picking out the newest BIOS, which was from the 9th of September, and downloading it. I then also proceeded to install GPU-Z, which I actually didn't have to do because I could have just saved the vBIOS ROM through the AMD ATI flash utility. But here you see me making a copy of the original vBIOS from my graphics card. And here I'm installing the AMD ATI flash utility, running it as administrator, and again making a copy of my original BIOS. And in the next step, I'm loading the image of the XT BIOS and trying to apply it. And I am greeted with the message subsystem IDs mismatch, which means that the AMD ATI flash utility did recognize that this was not the correct BIOS for this card. So I went and Googled how to unlock the AMD ATI flash utility to basically force flash this vBIOS onto the 5700 card or onto the 5700 BIOS chip. And I run command prompt as an administrator. I have the AMD ATI flash utility saved in an easy to copy location. And here you can see me with the commands in the background, -unlock ROM 0, unlocking the AMD ATI flash utility. And here's the message that it was successful. And in the next step, I'm executing the flash via command line by running the utility with -f, -p0 and the name of the ROM. Please keep in mind, if you do any of this, if you force flash, if you have a subsystem ID mismatch, all of this is done at your own risk. You might be breaking your card. I do not take any responsibility for this. You do all of this at your own risk. I'm sorry to say so, but I do not want to be responsible for people breaking their cards for whatever reason. I also strongly recommend that if you decide to flash any BIOS, motherboard or graphics card, always use a UPS. You don't want a brownout or a blackout to be responsible for the flash failing. So in the background you see the flash is actually executing, and here we have the message that the flash was successful and a system restart is required. So immediately after the restart I noticed this green tint on my video output, which was only present when I used HDMI, and it was only present when I was hooked up to my Elgato capture card. So when I hooked it up to a regular monitor, everything looked normal, like the black was black, not green like we can see here. And also, even when it was hooked up to the Elgato capture card, as soon as the display drivers were loaded, the issue was gone. So here you can see me running GPU-Z, and you will see that the card is now reported as a 5700 XT because the BIOS says it's a 5700 XT. So I ran my first benchmark, just stock out of the box default settings in the Radeon software, to see how much the BIOS flash itself was going to improve performance. And it was pretty substantial, because we managed to score on this TimeSpy graphics test higher than we did with our overclock on the 5700, a whopping 400 points more. So that was pretty nice to see. And in my next attempts I was trying to max out the frequency curve with the 5700 XT BIOS, but as you can see, I couldn't even get the benchmarks to run. Like they would crash and throw me back to the desktop. So I figured maybe it's a good idea to get a clean install on my drivers, because there might be, you know, an issue where the Radeon drivers still think it's a 5700 card or whatever. So I decided to do a reboot into safe mode and run the display driver uninstaller utility to really clean out the registry and any kind of display driver files that could be interfering. So once I booted into safe mode, I could once again see that ugly green tint on my Elgato capture card. I again checked on a monitor connected with HDMI. There was no issue, and on the Elgato there was this green tint. Either way, I saw that there was still driver information for the 5700 present in the system. So I ran the DDU utility and cleaned out everything, and proceeded to restart. I know a lot of people have had issues with the Radeon drivers recently, and I know a lot of people in forums online have said that their problems went away after properly DDUing the drivers and reinstalling. And my first run after restarting, you can see here the score was 8800, so pretty much the same as before with just the 5700 XT BIOS without any overclocking. I then proceeded to use the undervolt GPU option in the Radeon software, and also enabled the reverse statistics tuner on-screen display to monitor the frequency curves and power draw a little more closely. The undervolt option gave me actually a pretty decent score of 8881, which I think for 24/7 use would be pretty much ideal, coming at a low power draw as well. I then used the auto overclock feature in the Radeon software, which increased the max frequency or boost frequency to 2069 megahertz, but it comes in at quite a significantly higher power draw, about 10% higher than with the undervolt option. But it also scored 300 points higher at 9135. As for my final overclock, I used a custom frequency curve, increased the memory speed to 1850 megahertz, and increased the power limit by 20% over the default. And that gave me a pretty nice score of 9145 in this test. I was very happy with the settings and the power draw I observed, so I moved on to stress test the system. First by running TimeSpy Extreme Stress Test, which is 20 loops of the first graphics test of TimeSpy at 1440p, and that showed a great frame rate stability of 99.6%, so almost no deviation run to run, which means the card wasn't throttling. And I proceeded with Firestrike Extreme stress test. Same thing, it's 20 loops of, I think, the first test of Firestrike Extreme, so also 1440p. So here I saw the same result, almost no deviation in frame rate from run to run. I then proceeded to run a few basemark runs in Vulkan API at 1440p, which also passed. And I did another 2-minute Furmark run just to see how the power draw was. I do, however, not like running Furmark for extended periods of time because it's essentially a power virus and just replicating useless information just in order to increase the power draw while not actually increasing frame rates. So much for the benchmarks and testing. As we could see, we managed to get a pretty decent performance increase, about 8%, just from flashing the vBIOS with no adjustments to any overclocks or any tuning, any kind of manipulation in the Radeon software, and also about the same amount of performance gain from the auto overclock setting to my manual overclock on the 5700 XT BIOS. So 8% is nothing to scoff at, but please keep in mind you're doing this at your own risk. If you have a dual BIOS graphics card that has a dual BIOS switch, absolutely go ahead, go nuts. Flash one of the BIOS, enjoy the extra performance. Should it for some reason fail or you manage to brick that one BIOS chip, it's not the end of the world. You just keep using your card. But gaining 8% more performance for minimal work, in my opinion, is very nice, especially if you're like missing a couple of frames in like demanding games just to have a really smooth experience, or if you maybe in the future want to extend the lifespan of this card before upgrading to maybe the next generation, then I can wholeheartedly recommend it, just flashing the BIOS and getting that 8% extra performance. You paid for this card. The fact that the BIOS is flashable isn't your fault, but you should make use of it, in my opinion. This was Julian with Mainstream PC. I hope you liked this kind of content. If you liked it, leave a like. If you didn't like it, leave a dislike, but please let me know in the comments what you didn't like about it. If you want to subscribe to get notified about more content I'll be putting out. And I hope to see you again next time.